I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And I have joining me returning guest, the Chief Geoscientist from Imdex, Dr. Dave Lawie. Welcome, Dr. Dave.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be back. It's been a little while.
We got to be in the same place at the same time. We were in New York City in May. You gave some wonderful presentations about exactly what we're going to be talking about today. But I have to tell you, Dave, I kind of like these. I feel like I'm a time traveler because it's already, it's Monday night here and it's already Tuesday morning where you are. So it feels like I've traveled forward in time just by doing this podcast with you.
Well, if we were really doing that, then I could give you some bets on the Australian stock market this morning, Mike. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
No, it doesn't quite work out that way, does it? For our audience members that aren't familiar with you, let's give you a quick little overview of who you are and what Imdex is.
Yeah, so I'm the Chief Geoscientist at Imdex. I get involved in a lot of our geoscience strategy. Imdex is a global mining technology company. We're listed on the ASX. In fact, we're in the ASX 200, worth about $1.5 billion Australian dollars or pesos, whatever you want to put it, whichever way you want to put it currently. But we are truly a global company, which is one of the reasons I do like talking to you, Mike, because this pod goes out all over the place. And in fact, our largest region revenue-wise is the Americas, not Australia Pacific or Europe and Africa.
Yeah, and that's why I generally get to see you in my backyard 2 or 3 times a year. Generally once in Europe at the end of the year. So our paths do cross, and we do get to do these in the same place at the same time. But the last one of these we did was maybe 2 or 3 weeks before we were together in New York City in May at the SME conference that's held there annually. And we were talking, as we always do, we were talking about the gap in critical metals, where we are today, where government wants us to be versus where government wants us to be now and what the reality is. At that time, we did an overview of a lot of critical metals and the regions of the parts of the world where they actually mine the ore, and how it was bifurcated by those countries that lean towards the West or the United States versus those that lean towards the East or China. And we had a pretty good discussion on that, and I will put a link to that discussion at the end of the description of this, so people can go back and review that if they're hearing about this for the first time today. But we want to talk about processing because, you know what, the mines are where the mines are. But the key to all of this is, where is that ore processed? And that graph, it tells a whole different story than where the goods are mined.
Yeah, and that's why it got called the gap. I mean, there is, with the production, the mine production materials, if you look at where it comes from on that political axis between China and USA affiliated, then there is a gap, sure. But when you look at the refined production gap, it gets bigger, and in fact, it's far more stark. And if I can think of a quote which is sort of on track with current political events and what's in the news, you might say that this is a quotable quote, if you like, is we mine with our allies, but we refine with our adversaries. And if you want to think about it that way, that is certainly a geopolitical gap, if you like.
Yeah, I actually like that way of describing it, because that's actually true. And like, even if you take a look at this, we might, mine things like nickel and copper in our backyard, but we're not the ones processing it. It's going on ships, it's heading over to China or Indonesia, and it's being processed there and sent back to us. So when these people are adversaries and not necessarily allies, that's fraught with all sorts of significant challenges.
Oh, look, it certainly is. And if I can quote just a sentence that came out of the recent PwC mining report for 2025, which came out after I actually produced that graph, which we will link. But just to quote that report, says China processes more than 50% of production for 18 minerals and has processing dominance even in minerals that it doesn't mine at all, which is a great sentence, but yet horrifying. And I think if you think about that, Mike, and we go back to some of our earlier podcasts where we were talking about resource nationalism, I think what we're talking about now, and in fact, what is driving some of Trump's commentary with the 50% tariff on copper in the US, which I'm sure we'll get to, but now we're talking about processing nationalism rather than resource nationalism, or as a subset of resource nationalism, which is really becoming a new frontier in the Western world and how it thinks strategically about its minerals, which I might say is over time, about time, and a good thing.
Let's talk about copper, actually. It is a critical metal. We've typically beaten the rare earths to death when we've talked about this because China has shut down, the export of those materials, and in a lot of cases they process 90% of them. But 2 to 3 weeks ago, President Trump stated very emphatically that he was going to place a 50% tariff on copper product. And I started to look into it, and I'm fortunate, not only do I know people like yourself, but I know others in the market like Adam Hawkins, who is a mining engineer in Arizona, which is, in the middle of the copper country in the United States. I know Mike McGlone, who's the chief commodities strategist for Bloomberg. So I was able to call on both of those gentlemen and have them onto a pod to discuss copper. And it was really shocking. The United States, first off, doesn't mine enough copper to meet its own demands. So by tariffing copper, you're increasing the cost of the copper that's going to be needed for either infrastructure, goods, what have you. But even the amount of copper that the United States mines, there's not enough smelter capacity and processing capacity after the smelter to extract the ore and turn it into a workable product that they could turn out for infrastructure, etc. And a lot of the mined copper in the United States and even the recycled copper gets put on a ship and it gets sent to that country that begins with a C that everybody is very concerned about.
Yeah, and I think it's right that the US, if it could refine its own copper scrap, would satisfy its own internal copper requirements, which is, ironic to say the least. But we've spoken in the past around it's all right to say, well, we'll bring mines on stream, but that takes time. But to bring refining capacity on stream also takes time. And if a mine is at 15 to 20 year time frame, then a smelter and a refiner is probably half that, the 5 to 7 year time frame, $1 billion or $2 or $3 billion. Money's probably not here nor there now, but certainly the time frame is. And I think in the US economy, at least, getting people to work in these things these days is also going to be a challenge. Where you put them, people don't typically volunteer to have smelters put in their backyard anymore.
No, they don't. And the reality is, even if we were to permit all the mines that are possible, there's 3 smelters in the United States currently that can produce and smelt. If I remember, it was 45% to 50% of the mine's output in the United States. So you need more smelters to begin with, over top of all of that. And then there's no downstream processing after the smelter process. Even if we were to snap our fingers and have all that created overnight, we don't have a workforce that can go in and, build these things or operate them. So we're still in a bind.
It's still at a bite, and it's a time frame that extends beyond political cycles. So that also means it's a bit of a problem. But this has been as we've spoken about in the past, this is not a problem which has appeared overnight. It's been a good 3 decades in the making. But I will say, Mike, that even if we've spoken about these issues the last few years, when we first started speaking about them, there was virtually zero discussion in the public hemisphere about any of these problems, actually, resource nationalism, why we need things, why we need copper, why we need rare earths, etc. But if there's been one good outwashing or positive outwashing from everything that's going on at the moment, it's the first time in my life I've heard commodities being discussed in the general news in a positive, if problematic, but still positive frame about their importance for the first time in my professional lifetime, that's for sure, in the last 1 or 2 years. So, there is a silver lining on the edge of this cloud, but boy, we've got a cloud to get through first.
You're absolutely right. Like when we first did one of these was probably 2, maybe 3 years ago. You're correct on that, and
Yeah.
we were probably one of the first people to actually discuss the gap. We were in the industry. We knew the gap was there, but you tried to explain that to the general public, and they were literally oblivious to it. They figured, well, government said, you know, they want this done, so it'll get done. And the reality was that no, it can't be done because we don't have, you know, the resources to be able to make it happen. So yeah, you're right. From there, we're to the point where, in the last year, I've already attended 3 conferences in the last year that had a very strong critical metals theme to them. And then there's a new one that's going to show up in Minneapolis here the first week of October, put on by a lobby group called Better in Our Backyards in Minneapolis. Again, it's on the theme of resource nationalism in the United States and why aren't we mining and processing these things in our country, being the US. And 3 years ago, I don't think none of those events were on the schedule at all. And so it is becoming a greater concern for everybody. But at the same time, I'm looking to governments to try and work our way through this. We need jobs training for people to get into these. We need an environment where people can invest in these types of processes and mines and everything. And the reality is we have to make compromises to reshore these things back into our backyards. As you pointed out, there's not a whole lot of people that are going to be overly thrilled to have a smelter operating in their backyard, unless they have a job in that smelter.
If you told me 3 years ago that there would be a conference or an event held in the US that said better in our backyards related to the mining industry, I would have laughed that off as pure fantasy. But there you go, and here we are. Really quite amazing. There are some other things also going on, Mike, which are also interesting, which relate to the gap. And one of them is the Section 899 of the Big Beautiful Bill, Trump's big, we call it just his big bill, if you like, where he was going to, and this is an interesting one because it segues to developing resources in the US, where the US government was going to extract punitive taxes from other countries, revenge taxes, if you like. And that was going to probably apply to companies like BHP and Rio. And they quoted, off the record, of course, not just said to someone, the Australian Financial Review, because, of course, BHP and Rio are looking to bring Resolution Copper on stream. They've already invested $2 or $3 billion of that. But with this punitive tax measure, Their quote was, "You're asking us to build your smelters, bring your capital and secure your metals, but then you tax us for being foreign." And their quote, "That's not friend shoring, that's friend fracturing." Um, it's just another layer of things that are going on in the background. But fortunately, that provision in the, as it's called, the Big Beautiful Bill, was removed. Woodside, another Australian company, got caught up with that as well. So this, the geopolitics of it, the political alignments of it are really complex. But every now and then, some little bit of rational information comes out, or if you call something, if it's rational to get rid of something, it was irrational in the first place, which didn't need to happen. Well, that's our definition of rational these days. But nevertheless,
Is
that
that the
got fixed.
definition of government?
We'll start to stray into a different podcast, Mike. But yeah, it probably is actually. But in the end, the right outcome was achieved. But it was just an interesting outworking a lot of the tensions that are being created in the world around these sorts of things.
Yeah, there is. But at the same time as we talk about this, there are some steps being made in North America, at least, that seem to be, especially on the rare earth side of the equation, seem to be taking place that are um, moving some of the gap closer. You've got investments being made in Arizona by Ucore to process rare earths. Again, in Arizona, by Energy Fuels, again, to process rare earths. You've got the Department of National Defense and another contract with Apple to a company called MG Enterprises to process the rare earth magnets that are going to go into defense and cellular phones. Um, Now, the outputs of these are going to be considerably higher than the Chinese processing, but it's appearing that some of those compromises that I speak about are starting to be made where, okay, we need to do this here, just make it happen. And, cost be damned, we need to process this here.
Yeah, and again, that's a theme we've spoken about in the past. One of the ways out of this was the governments, Western governments, would just have to participate in the supply chain and underwrite some of these materials. I think I've said to you in the past, we could make the whole thing go away probably with a $20 billion investment, because we don't. So although we don't need a lot of some things like the antimonies, tungstens, rare earths, we still need them, but they're all eminently fixable if you want to get away from the conventional market economics of them. So to see the US government entering the supply chain to secure the supply of some of these things, and I think with what's the name of the company, MP Materials over there at Mountain Pass, investing 400 million there, and Apple investing another 500 to put money into them to make magnets out of the outputs, underwriting the rare earth product at about $100 a pound rather than market rate of 50 for 10 years. I think those sorts of deals will become more commonplace, but I think they're relevant with those sorts of metals and minerals, if you like. But when we move on to things like copper, they're required in such large tonnages that it sort of doesn't work. But nevertheless, fixing up some of those with some of those strategies, I think makes a lot of sense, and I think it's just absolutely necessary. I just think one thing is that the Americans will expand that sort of activity out to more, we'll call it friend shoring if we go back to that, although some of the things we've said would seem to fly in the face of it. But for example, with the Canadians and over here in Australia as well, I think another place we're entering the supply chain of the metals, we sort of alluded to it a bit about building smelters, is we have a problem here at the moment in Australia right now where we have two copper smelters in Mount Isa and Townsville, which are uneconomic to run at the moment because the Chinese are subsidising the crap out of their own copper smelters, so they're making it uneconomic. So this is a problem here right now. It's very topical because Glencore's thinking, well, if we don't get any support from the Australian government, we're going to shut down these two copper smelters. And so this fits into the narrative of China trying to deindustrialize the Western world just through excessive subsidies in its own backyard. So we're looking at this now going, well, will the Australian government, I mean, you've just seen the American government investing in Mountain Pass with the rare earths, would the Australian government come into the rescue of 2 copper smelters to keep them running, just to keep, to mitigate sovereign risk, to make sure we have the ability to produce copper metal, not just for us, but also the Western world? And there's, some people are joking here that, if these smelters didn't exist right now, we'd probably be talking about building them as part of a reaction to this geopolitical problem with the mining supply of materials. But we have 2 that are running, and we can't make up our minds about what to do with them to keep them operating or not. Now, sure, these smelters are probably older and they may not be as efficient as the Chinese ones. I don't know. I really don't know about that. That may not be the case. But nevertheless, would the Australian government let them be shut down, and then we'd just be back to exporting concentrates and leaving the country as a giant quarry yet again?
Well, and that's part of the reality in processing a lot of these materials, because China does a lot of it. Their economies of scale are better than ours. Their plants are probably more efficient, but they also don't have environmental laws. They don't have human resource laws, labor laws. So a lot of the things that add costs in the West, China doesn't have to deal with. I laughingly point out whenever I'm in an ESG roundtable panel at a conference, it's just like you put us at a significant disadvantage. But again, those are about those compromises again. But one of the things that I learned through the discussions after the copper tariff got put on, it's that the smelter business has got a very narrow margin to begin with. And if China, for whatever advantages they have, can produce it at a much lower cost, it makes it very difficult to operate a smelter profitably in the West without some form of subsidy. And, subsidy is like a dirty word in the United States. That's like tantamount to socialism in a lot of cases. So in the meantime, they try and hit others with a stick instead of providing a carrot for those that are going to help solve the problem internally.
Yes, indeed. It is a pretty low margin business, smelting, and that's why it depends. If you're an integrated business, then you can push the costs around and work out where you make out your money. But if you separate the smelting from the mining, then it can be a bit more problematic. But ironically, Mike, I'm just looking at the gap graphic, which you'll link into the show notes after this. Copper is the one thing that China does not provide more than 50% of. One of the few things which is critical, which it doesn't, according to this data here, it provides well with 44% of refined copper product. The next ones being a combination of Chile, Japan, Germany, and South Korea, which is okay. But somewhere in there, Australia has an import, and if it was to shut them down, then that would bump up that Chinese number again, which is not where the world is trying to go at the moment.
No, but it was also brought to my attention, and we talk about the carrot and the stick in the United States, but the United States does have something very unique at its disposal. It's called the Defense Production Act. They utilized it during the COVID pandemic to rapidly, create vaccine for people to refuse to take. But they also used it to get more ventilators built to help those who were going to be hospitalized, masks for those who wanted to wear masks to protect themselves. So they were able to rev up production of these crucial things during a crisis. It's available. They could take and create a military base in the middle of Nevada out in the desert and build a smelter and produce the and smelt out the copper from the concentrate, and they could next door to that they could build a processing plant to process that copper if they chose to do so, or they could enter into, like they did with MP Ventures, a profitable partnership with industry to do that if they chose to do so, but they don't seem to be going down that particular pathway.
Yeah, the other thing the US has, and certainly over Australia, is cheap energy of whatever form you want to take it in, much cheaper energy, which would help, of course. But I think like people, or the private sector gets very leery around investment in these sorts of things, which is in the billions and takes 5 to 10 years to get going before you see a return. And with with the, what would you call it, the politically unstable climate, if you don't know what's going to be going on in 5 or 7 years, and if your offtake agreement or your co-investment agreement evaporated in after 3 or 4 years, and you'd committed to a project like this, if you thought that was even a possibility, then your willingness to even start the process would be, compromised, to say the very least. So these investments, I mean, there is that realization now that these things need to be fixed. We need to be onshoring production, not just mining. That you need the right and stable environment to do that, because to do any of this goes well past political cycle timelines. That's one thing which is a bit, just a bit harder to get your mind around. Even with Mountain Pass and those things, I think they can get some of those things up and running in 2, 3, 4 years, which is probably okay. But when we're talking about trying to tackle some of these bigger issues, then we're talking, if you're really, really optimistic, 5, but most likely a median of 10 years to get these things going. You just need that certainty that you'll be able to put your money in and get it back out and make a profit at the same time.
Yeah, let's go through a quick little exercise here, because in the United States, it'll take you 20 to 25 years to essentially become a mine. So if you're coming on board right now, your project started when George W. Bush was the president of the United States. It takes 5 to 7 years for you to get a smelter up and running. So that's the case. You were probably midway in Trump's first term.
Yeah.
Trying to get this a start. It takes 3 to 5 for a processing plant. So you're in the middle of the Biden era. So that supply chain process has gone through 3 cycles, and we completely skipped over the Obama era, because if you're coming to permit today, that was George W. Bush, and there was no point in having a smelter without the mine. So again, you skipped over the 8 years of Obama through this entire process. And again, it's time consuming, and you're right. There's an awful lot of risk to commerce to build these things, given that they could build it and there's problems at the back end geopolitically, that makes it fraught with issues. So what do you think government needs to do to start to incentivize some of these bottlenecks that we see appearing within the gap? There's permitting reform. We've talked about that. But again, there's, we need investment, we need human resource capital, we need, all sorts of things, and then the public's buy-in as well.
Yeah. It's interesting to think that when the Indonesians banned the export of unfinished nickel, well, it was about 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years ago. But since then, they've managed to build 60 smelters and completely dominate the production of nickel. They'll certainly grab the lion's share, but control the price globally with investment from the Chinese, of course. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, if there's a will, there's a way. If you can get out of your own way. Now, whether the Western world is ready to do that or not, I'm not sure. In parallel to all of this resource stuff, I know that in the US, Canada, and Australia, we have what's called the housing crisis, put that in quotes. But one of the things that people are now saying about that is, well, if it's a crisis, treat it as such and do something about it. It's a bit the same here. Like, if we really think we have a geopolitical risk around the production supply of metals and components we need to build things, then do something about it. Now, I think that doing something about it is permitting, etc., but it's also access to stable capital to allow you to fund these things into the future. And I think, a bit like Mountain Pass and things like that, I think governments are going to have to start underwriting offtake agreements or guaranteed contracts to buy materials that are produced if you want the stability of supply in either your own country or within a geopolitical sphere that you trust. I can't see much way around that. I really can't. Because even what's copper now? I don't know. I mean, it's higher, maybe around $10,000 a ton. I'm talking tons, not pounds. But we've had the Western world's big copper companies have come out and said, look, if we're going to really arc up our investment and even looking for copper and bringing more copper into mining production, not refining and production, they would want to see a sustained price of $15,000 a ton. So we're not there yet. So there are still headwinds. We've been talking around the refined production, but there are still headwinds at the production side when the price of copper is still not responding to a lot of these issues. And the capital, we still have the problem where the capital intensity per ton of copper produced keeps going up, or just with inflation and just even beyond inflation now. So we have a few problems that both ends of the stick. Neither end of the stick is particularly easy to solve. And meanwhile, the demand for copper just follows its inexorable 3% CAGR increase year on year. So we treat it as a crisis. I think we're starting to talk about it in the right way. But I think the conversation's now matured from not just exploring it and mining it, but right through to refining it. So, in one way, we've handed off the control of a lot of these metals, even more so. You said at the start that the mines are where the mines are. Not much you can do about that, but there is a geopolitical fight over them, irrespective of their geographic location. But if you can centralise the refining of these materials in your own country, then you really do have the proper chokehold on the world, actually, with getting its hands on these materials. That processing nationalism, I think, is a dire problem.
Well, and here's another reality check for the public and for government. A miner earns more than the average income. A smelter operator earns more than the average income. A processor earns more than the average income. The manufacturing that comes out of the processing of all of this are good middle-class jobs. You're building wealth in your nation. You're giving people opportunities to earn some significant earnings and not, go to school to be a glorified barista. And you would think government would be all over that for, not only is it good for the country and for the nation state, but it's good for the tax base as well. Can you imagine if you're a small town in, the middle of America and they put a copper smelter in your neighborhood, all of a sudden you've got an entire town's worth of folk that are earning, really good money and contributing to a local economy, that's going to be a town that's going to boom and prosper.
Yeah, well, to go back to the two copper smelters here in North Queensland, they generate, the smelters themselves, the industries around it, they generate 17,000 jobs in that part of the world, those two smelters. And it's, obviously it's not just the smelter, it's all the rail systems. There's byproducts that come out of smelting like fertilizer and sulfuric acid, just et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, it's not as though someone's getting the money and throwing it in the bin. It's, it does generate income as well, and tax paying. People pay taxes on all of that, so it does go into the economy, and a productive part of the economy as well. We provide. Again, we're probably drifting off into a different type of podcast here, but the government provides a lot of subsidies here, Canada and the US, which ends up accruing into equity rather than being spent in the economy. So it accrues up the income scale rather than being spread through the vast majority of the economy. I think another way the governments could look at some of these things, the investment in providing this infrastructure is truly job creation, and those people that earn money in those jobs spend it and use it in the economy. So it's a good investment, and the government sees its returns very quickly.
Well, yeah, and in the case of the mines, we want the smelter somewhat close to the mines, and these mines aren't generally near big cities. They're out in remote areas, and you would think you would get bipartisan support for things of this nature. It's good working class, middle class jobs that pay very well. It's reaching out to rural America that is lacking opportunities in the way the economy is currently set up. You would think that both sides of the aisle would be going, this is a win-win. We should be all over this and figuring out a way to make it happen. But again, I hear a lot of talk, but I don't see a lot of action.
I think, well, there's another gap, if you like, that gap. I think that gap is getting narrower when it comes down to some of these discussions now. And again, I take that back to just the elevation of people just talking about these things. I mean, only time you ever hear about mining typically is in a negative, perceived negatively in the general media, but that has changed the last 12, 24 months. So I think you look at both sides of the aisle, no matter where you are, Canada, Australia, US, elsewhere, and I think there is, in Europe, we should bring Europe into this world, and the attitude to mining has shifted radically in the EU as well. I think that's sort of a different conversation now, and I think it would be possible with the right incentives to get a majority support around some of these things. Government co-investment in getting, either mines started or underwriting the offtake and the construction of downstream processing equipment, down processing stages.
Yeah, it would certainly move the needle and move this forward, and we could start to, maybe close the gap. Although the gap itself is a timeline, because they want things done in a timeline that's not practical to occur, but we would at least be able to see where a finish line could realistically, exist if we were to do this. And we've talked about copper, we've talked about rare earths, nickel, and all these things. As we move to energy addition, which we are moving towards, the demand for these materials is going to increase, not decrease, because they're going to need more copper line for electric vehicles. They're going to need it for electricity. They're going to need it for AI. They're going to need it to generate more power, and so on and so on and so on. So it's in everyone's best interest to build these things in our backyard.
Oh, look, it certainly is. And, there's that old adage that makes you sound old saying it, but the one thing you can't buy is time. That is the one restricted resource on the planet is time. So the longer we fiddle, the more of it we waste, and you just can't get that back. But when people put their minds to things, they can get things done more quickly than they have done in the past. There's no doubt about that. But let's see where the world goes. If the governments around the world can provide the private industry with more certainty around a lot of these things or underwrite things, then things could get moving more quickly.
Yeah, they could. It'd be nice if we could all in the West get together and formulate a plan. But as I say, under the current, I'm going to tariff you, I'm going to tariff that. It's making it very difficult to do that.
Oh, look, that's the obvious way out of that is, the listeners would have heard about AUKUS and Five Eyes and things like that. So it is possible to get this Western style cooperation going between governments, but perhaps we need something like that around just resources and mineral processing to equal things up in the world, because if we don't, then we've got a fairly unreliable, I would say, or stalled or an unreliable future, because this whole threat to deindustrialize the Western world is real, and I think the Western world needs to get on and do something about that.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And if people want to follow our musings going forward on this topic, how are they best to do so, Dave?
Well, we'll talk again, obviously, Mike. So following this podcast is a good thing to do. In between doing these sorts of podcasts and articles that pop up, I do put the odd thing on LinkedIn. People can find me there using my fairly weird surname. That makes it pretty easy. But I also get around talking at a few events. So there's the SEG meeting, there's the Society of Economic Geologists meeting in Brisbane coming up in September, October. We'll be there. I will see you again in the flesh, Mike, at Mines and Money, or whatever it's called now, in London.
It's resourcing tomorrow, and it's now part of London Mining Week. The whole first week of December is been declared London Mining Week now. So I guess we're part of a bigger thing.
Well, there you go. There's a small example of how the attitudes towards mining are changing, which is great, even in that part of the world. So yeah, I'll be in London now. Well, we'll both be there. But if anyone listening to this wanted to catch up to one or both of us and have a talk about this, it would be great. And I dare say, mate, we'll organise one of these chats from there.
I would love it. It's always good to see you in the flesh, and I don't get that whiplash from the time travel that we have when we do these by Zoom.
Yeah, I'm sure. It depends what time of day we do them. One of us is going to be jet lagged coming from other sides of the planet to London. We can work.
Well, when we both go to London, it's just the question which one of us is more jet lagged, because we both kind of end up that way.
I look forward to it, Mike.
Okay. You take care, Dave, and thank you very much for the time this evening.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. See you.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.